but all of it was to extend or elaborate or enrich the philosophical. He produced a huge collection of essays called Parerga and Parallel, Basis of Morality and the Freedom of the Will. There was also a little book called On the Will in Nature, designed to show that his ideas were supported by discoveries in science. Most important of all, he published a revised edition of The World as Will and Representation, which was more than twice the length of the original volume. There are several remarkable things about him. Although in direct succession to
Happy
Kant,
New Year!
his own
Welcome
work
to TV
securely in
and
the mainstream
2021.
of Western, and is the only major Western philosopher of thought. He was the first major Western philosopher to be openly and explicitly atheist. He placed the arts higher in the scheme of things and had more to say about them than any other important philosopher. And perhaps partly for that reason, his influence on creative artists of the front rank has exceeded that of any other philosopher of the modern era. He was himself among the supreme writers of German prose. Many of his sentences are so brilliantly aphoristic that they've been torn out of context by the hundred and published separately in little books of epigrams. Intellectually, this is a catastrophe, because it obscures the fact that Schopenhauer is first the system, whose philosophy can be understood only as a whole. Of the books in print about it, the most recent is by me, but I can't very well interview myself, so I'd invited the author of one of the others to come along and discuss Schopenhauer with me. My guest is, in any case, the most distinguished living historian of philosophy in the English language, Frederick Copleston, Emeritus Professor in the University of London. In addition to his extended treatment of Schopenhauer in his 9-volume History of Philosophy, he's written a separate book about him called Arthur Schopenhauer, Philosopher of Pessimism. Well, Professor Copleston, I think the place we ought to start is by hello. Perhaps I should let you take that up.
Mr. McGee, I think that, like other original philosophers, a great many of them, Schopenhauer wanted to understand the world in which he found himself, the world in which he lived, or one could say,
Happy New Year! Welcome to 2K TV and 2021.
Happy New Year, everyone. I've been spending a lot of time with the fans out there on the park, and guess what? You guys
over
have been
the
absolute
world of phenomena, the plurality of phenomena. I think that is it. And to do that, Schopenhauer thought that it was necessary to identify the underlying reality. If one asks why he thought that there was an underlying reality to identify, I suppose that the reason, one main reason, is that he started from the premises of Immanuel Kant, and that he thought that the way in which we see the world is a human perspective, that the human mind is pre-programmed to see the world in certain ways, and we can't, for example, experience objects except as situated in space and time, as subject to spatial temporal relations, and as subject to the relation of causality. But it obviously doesn't follow that because things appear to one in a certain way, that is how they are apart from the way in which they appear, as they are in themselves. Kant says that the concept of a thing in itself is not as that which appears, but can be considered in distinction from the appearance, was a sensible idea, and should.
How do you do? How do you do, Lord Ruffle? Won't you sit down? Now, what have we got to talk about?
Well, Lord Russell, as you approach your 80th birthday, I think we'd like you to tell us what you think you have learned and what you think you will never learn in your career as a philosopher.
Well, there are some things that I don't think I shall ever learn, and that indeed I hope I shall never learn. I don't wish to learn to change my views of the world. I'm prepared to change my beliefs about the state of the world, about what happens, but not about what I hope. But that I hope to remain constant. I think we might call the subject of our talk 80 years of changing beliefs and unchanging hope. It's very difficult for anybody born since 1914 to realize how profoundly different the world is now from what it was when I was a child. Change has been almost unbelievable. I try as best I can, in spite of my years, to get used to living in a world of atom bombs, a world where ancient empires vanish like morning mist, where we have to accustom ourselves to Asiatic self-assertion, to the communist menace. The world is altogether so different from what it was when I was young, that it's an extraordinarily difficult thing for an old man to live in such a world. I was born in 1872. My parents died when I was still an infant, and so I was brought up by my grandparents.
Can you tell us something about your grandfather?
Yes, I can tell you something about my grandfather. He was born in the early years of the French Revolution. He was a member of Parliament while Napoleon was still on the throne. In common with all the Whig followers of Fox, he thought English hostility to Napoleon was excessive, and he visited Napoleon in Elba. It was he who introduced the Reform Bill in 1832, which started England on the road towards democracy. He was Prime Minister during the Mexican War, during the revolutions of 1848. I remember him quite well, but as you can see, he belonged to an age that now seems rather remote. And the world where I was young was a solid world, a world where all kinds of things that have now disappeared were thought to be going to last forever. It didn't dawn on people that they would cease. English people certainly regarded English naval supremacy as a sort of law of nature. Britannia ruled the waves. It occurred to us that that might stop.
Even with Bismarck?
Bismarck was regarded as a rascal, and was thought of as a sort of uneducated farmer. But it was assumed that the influence of Goethe and Schiller would gradually bring Germany back to a more civilized point of view. And moreover, we thought of Germany as only a land power. Germany had at that time no navy. We weren't at all afraid of Germany. In fact, liberal opinion was more favorable to Germany than to France at that time. Bismarck himself compared Germany and England to an elephant and a whale, each formidable in its own element, but no danger to each other. And that was how we felt, so we were not afraid of Bismarck at all. It was thought that there was going to be ordered progress throughout the world. Gradually, every country was going to take to parliaments. There was going to be a bicameral legislature and two parties, and it was all going to be exactly like England everywhere, all over the world. My grandmother used to laugh because one time she said to the Russian ambassador, "Perhaps someday you will have a parliament in Russia." And he said, "God forbid, my dear Lady Russell." Except for the first word, the Russian ambassador.
One last question. Suppose, Lord Russell, this film were to be looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time. What would you think it's doing telling that generation about the life you've lived and the lessons you've learned from it?
I should like to say two things. One, intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say to them is this. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear. Never let yourself be diverted and solely at what are the facts. That is the intellectual thing that I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say to them is very simple. I should say, love is wise.
Here with some of your top plays.
Let's get it started. Here's your top blocks brought to you.
It's getting more and more closely interconnected. We have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. And if we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance, which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet.
One last question. Suppose, Lord Russell, this film were to be looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time.
From the 50s onwards, his main concern was the threat of nuclear annihilation. He was the
Private conversation, he was wont to say that homicidal lunatics were well employed in killing each other, but that sensible men would keep out of their way while they were doing it. He appeared in extreme old age, full of enjoyment, no doubt owing in large measure to his invariable health. For political endurance in last years, he was a
Hey everyone, and welcome to the WNBA on 2K Sports. And on tap tonight, it's the Connecticut Sun going up against the Los Angeles Sparks. Along with Tim.
Asked about me when I died. I observed that the date I attributed to myself, 1960.